What are some stories of intelligent people believing stupid things? Story 1. My ex-boyfriend's mother was a linguistics professor and knew over 10 languages. She was also one of the dumbest people I've ever met. Some examples: she believed that in case of emergency, stewardesses catapult out of the plane. She was also convinced donating blood causes some blood diseases and you can die because of it. But my favorite one was when she said her son's orthopedic problems are not a result of a serious injury that he had. His knee hurts because he eats too much ketchup. She believed that if you regularly donate blood, your body starts producing more than it needs to the point where your skin turns red and you eventually die of having too much blood. I was tempted to ask if she has periods. Ah yes, the classic one grain of truth widely misinterpreted. There actually is a blood disorder, polycythemia, where you literally have too much blood. The treatment? Why, donating blood, of course. No, really, it's literally as simple as you have too much blood, so we're gonna take some. Oof, sounds like a bad combo of thinking out loud. I hope. Half remembering a lot of stuff and forgetting the context and then sticking with it despite it not making sense. Or else she's repeating from someone else who did the same. The emergency catapult thing I'm guessing is from the media. The blood disease was HIV in the 80s, and the ketchup is because solanine aggravates arthritis and sugar aggravates gout. They're all at least half wrong in the new context. You'd think that someone who comes across people who make assumptions about their specialty would realize they're making assumptions about others, but here we are. Story 2. My professor, a brilliant neurosurgeon, once decided to directly smell a bottle of ammonia. He then told me, "Don't smell that." I did not plan to. I feel a bit silly, but I'm about to Google why this is bad. In my defense, I don't have a PhD and I'm not a professor or a neurosurgeon. Okay, so it could explode when it reacts with air, can cause respiratory problems, and large concentrations can cause your eyes to tear or give you a pulmonary edema. Ammonia is a biological waste product that is toxic in high concentrations, but more importantly is extremely bad smelling, like ridiculously so. Well, at least he was trying to help, I guess. Story 3. I had a boss who was an engineer who put a couple $100 in change in a bank's pneumatic drive-through tube where it got stuck and they had to use a jackhammer to get it out. He was upset that the bank was charging him for this because he didn't know this would happen. They had large signs saying not to put change in the tubes, including on the tubes themselves. At many banks, there are multiple drive-through lanes where you can stay in your car to withdraw or deposit money. Some lanes are next to the building, but other lanes are farther away. You talk through a speaker and money and forms pass back and forth through a plastic case that you insert in a tube that basically uses air to suck the tube either underground between you and the bank teller or sometimes overhead because it's using air or pneumatics. It can't handle anything very heavy. You'd expect an engineer to know this. Being in construction, I have met several engineers who are very book smart but lack the common sense to be able to apply their knowledge to unforeseen issues in the field. I've had several arguments about how their plan will not work and they just lack the understandings as to why it won't work, and it's like nothing you say can convince them sometimes. I made a quick habit of forming good relationships with engineers who know how to adapt their design to unforeseen changes in the field. Once you get another engineer on board with you, then the stubborn engineer will usually see their error and go back to a redesign or head out your ideas for a fix. Very frustrating. This guy did not think it all the way through, and/or didn't read the sign that specifically says not to put coins in. You take those coins into the tellers, or use a Coinstar machine. That's its purpose. Story 4. My first call at my first IT job was in a medical laboratory. There was a doctor who had been in the job for years and she called saying her computer would not power on. I walked her through some troubleshooting and nothing worked. Is the computer plugged in? Okay. Is the monitor on? Okay. When did the problem start? Types of questions were asked, and she answered them all. I go up to her office and indeed the computer is plugged into a power strip, which is plugged into itself. Cleaning crew had deep cleaned her office and never plugged anything back in. Doctor plugged the power strip into itself, thinking that as long as it was plugged in, that's all she needed. Part of me wonders if she got the cords mixed up, like she thought that she was plugging in something other than the power strip. Depending on the lengths of the cords, I could see it getting lost in the tangle and just plugging it in. Oh man, this reminds me of one of my first office jobs, but it was not in IT. The company outsourced to an external IT company, but because they didn't have anyone on site, they used to rely on me as the young tech-savvy kid kid to help with all sorts of tech problems, things like printers being unplugged, or having the wrong paper tray selected, monitor VGA cables coming loose so the screens were black, or had a floating error message on them, or someone who I think had OCD getting frustrated at the mess on their desk. She got angry and ripped out the pointless doodad that cluttered up her desk. That pointless doodad was one of the old school wireless USB receivers that connected her keyboard and mouse to her computer. Essentially, all the problems I had to deal with were what I call common sense tech problems. Like, I'm quite tech savvy, but I can't do 90% of what a real IT person does, like setting up networks and all that jazz. But to most of my office, I was the next Bill Gates. I didn't mind though. The higher-ups seemed to really appreciate my help and wouldn't bust my balls if I missed my actual job targets, because I was so helpful in other areas. And it was an almost daily occurrence that something tech-related would go wrong, so they seemed to understand that my time was often taken up with other things. The pay was crappy, but I really missed that company. I'm sure IT is full of stories like this. I have a little anxiety that I'll be the subject of one of these stories. Story 5. I have a PhD, and I work with a bunch of PhDs. Basically, a lot of them think that because they succeeded in one area, they are an expert in every other area of life, and they always have strong opinions about everything. I think it's also called a PhD syndrome. One of the main benefits of my education was to teach me how much I don't know. It's baffling to me that people get confidence to speak on things they don't know anything about, just because they're educated. My dad, who has a PhD in applied math, told me meth is a complex chemical chain with molecules stringing all over it, or something to that effect, when I asked after watching an episode of Breaking Bad. Look up the chemistry of methamphetamine molecules. I'm a bit of an idiot, but I wouldn't assume knowledge like he does. Story 6. I went to 3 ERs when I felt something was wrong with my arm. It felt like a bug bite day 1, and by day 4, a bungee cord from my elbow to my wrist. 3 doctors said it was a skin irritation or dermatitis. I kept telling them something was wrong. I have no medical degree. I work in property management. Day 5, I walked into another ER and said, I don't care if I have to pay out of pocket or sit here all night, but something is wrong with my arm. Finally, after many rude looks and comments, I was given an ultrasound of my arm. Then I was rushed to an MRI. Then I was told I was being admitted. A 3-inch blood clot in my upper arm, 2 in my chest area, and 1 had passed my lung already. Diagnosed with factor 2 gene mutation 22 days later, blood clotting disorder. My parents' neighbor complained of a bad headache, so they went to the ER. They told him he did have just a bad headache and sent him on his way. The stroke he was having left him paralyzed for the rest of his life. He lived for 3 more years, and it took 2 more after that for them to settle the lawsuit against the ER. My wife and/or unborn child nearly died because the doctor who regularly checked her due to a high risk of having preeclampsia thought the checks weren't needed anymore. Even after checking into the hospital with all the symptoms of preeclampsia and having extreme pain, they didn't check and said it was just her having labor pain. Thank God a young doctor in the hospital took her seriously after another routine check, and what do we know, my child was born via C-section half an hour later. It was almost too late. In these stories of being misdiagnosed or undiagnosed, the doctors are fallible, but the consequences of those mistakes can be catastrophic. Story 7. My wife's stepfather was a chemist who currently has diabetes. One night, he went to the ER because his blood sugar was dangerously high. He claimed he was eating well. He normally does not, so there's no reason why his blood sugar was high. In his car was a 2-liter bottle of ginger ale mixed in with grape juice. He said that the 2 canceled their sugars out, and we didn't know what we were talking about because he was a chemist, and he knows how to combine things. With respect to sugar, unless you're doing a low-sugar juice, you've got the same numbers as soda, because he doesn't drink diet. But when I was hearing this, I'm just trying to imagine the taste. This happened earlier this year, and he still argues he's right. Like, dude, you add a vodka kicker to a margarita, does it suddenly cancel out the alcohol? Or is a Long Island iced tea no longer potent because you've canceled everything else out? I'm no scientist, but I've added my sodas together when I was younger, and I never had sudden regular tasting water. I didn't know that Steve Jobs was a chemist, but for real, Steve Jobs, by all regarded as one of the most brilliant marketers of all time, and when he was diagnosed with a more treatable form of pancreatic cancer, he said, "Forget modern medicine. My organ that regulates blood sugar level, I'll just eat nothing but sugar, fruit, and that'll cure my struggling organ." Like someone with a liver disease giving up on water and committing only to drink beer. His stupidity in one area led to his death, despite his brilliance in other areas. These are sad instances of people not believing what doctors are telling them about their conditions and how to treat them. Story 8. I was at a keg party at college, and the gravity keg was set up. Someone complained that the beer was not flowing, so I checked that the keg was still almost full. Turns out someone closed the air intake on top. I opened the intake and poured myself a beer. Problem solved. A few minutes later, someone else complains the beer is out. I told them the keg was full a few minutes ago, and it was a tap problem that I fixed. They told me they just came from the keg. I go back to the keg and find the intake was closed again. Opened it and poured the young lady who said it was empty beer. As she is leaving, my suite mate comes in and goes to the intake and closes it. Now, my suite mate is a straight A student who gets all A's mostly due to his photographic memory. Back to the keg. So I tell him that he needs to leave the intake open to let air in to displace the beer coming out of the lower tap. He then proceeds to tell me that since the beer is carbonated, air is not needed to replace the liquid volume lost when the beer is dispensed. So I asked him 2 questions. If it is not needed, why is there an upper tap? And does he really think the amount of gas the carbonation gives off in a glass of beer is equal to the volume of the liquid beer? He thought for a few seconds, and his only response was, "I have a 4.0 GPA. What's your GPA?" Then he walked away. This is the biggest reason I dislike Reddit responses that begin with, "I'm a XXX student." Students don't know anything. They don't know what they don't know. They only know what they've been told thus far, and seem to forget the past 15 years of education, where they were constantly learning what they knew in the past was wrong or incomplete. It's the worst with engineering students here. Dude, I don't care if you just finished your first statistics course. I've been in the industry for a decade, and that's not the way it's handled in the real world. Years ago, a friend of mine was hosting a party for a group of fraternity friends from college. Everyone was in their mid-40s, and I wasn't a part of this group, different college and fraternity. I got a phone call from my friend asking me if I know how to tap a keg. I said, "Of course I know how. What's the issue?" After 10 minutes on the phone trying to explain, I said, "Why don't I just come over and take a look?" He lived 5 minutes away from me. I get there and see about a dozen guys, all college grads in the same fraternity, messing around with the keg. They're getting ready to take the keg back to where they bought it. I said, "Let me take a look." I had it tapped and dispensed beer in 2 minutes. The look of embarrassment on their faces was classic. I ended up having a few beers with them. So I guess it's tricky to tap a keg of beer? It looks easy when other people do it. Story 9. Peter Duesberg, molecular biologist who works as a researcher at UC Berkeley and has an otherwise stellar career and well known for his work, became an AIDS denialist, claiming there's no link between HIV and AIDS, led countless people down the rabbit hole, including many who were HIV positive. These individuals ended up infecting others and refusing antiretroviral therapies. This included an AIDS denialist activist named Christine Majery, who infected her infant through breastfeeding, thinking, "Hey, it's not a big deal, it's just HIV, it doesn't cause AIDS." Angrily logged in to upvote this. Duesberg the idiot is still referenced and revered by AIDS denialists, a robust and crotchety underbelly of people who basically hate gays and Africans. Like gum on your granddad's boot, Duesberg somehow maintains his tenure at Berkeley despite his willful ignorance and misinformation. See also Nobel Prize-winning biochemist Kary Mullis, who, despite not doing any HIV/AIDS research himself, denied a link between HIV and AIDS. UC Berkeley seems to really attract these people. David Raznick, another biochemist who, in his arrogance, conducted experiments on vulnerable populations in Africa, denying life-saving medications in favor of vitamins because he believes AIDS does not exist. The list goes on once you start reading into it. I dated an AIDS denialist when I was younger and wish I could go back in time to punch his dumb face. I later worked with populations experiencing HIV/AIDS, and the deniers are just so ignorant. Astonishing ignorance and delusion. Christine Marjorie denied that HIV causes AIDS, was a presenter at the 13th AIDS conference in Durban, South Africa. Big hit with President Becky and convinced him to block AZT treatment to pregnant HIV-positive mothers in South Africa. WHO estimates 330,000 mothers and children died due to that decision. She passed HIV to her baby, who died at the age of 4 from AIDS. Marjorie herself died 2 years later in 2008 from AIDS. This seems beyond stupid. This is consciously saying something very detrimental to others. I could go on, but I don't want to get all, controversial. Vaccines. It's about vaccines. Story 10. I worked with a girl that graduated from Brown. She would never shut up about it. Always Brown this and Brown that. I went to a state school, and it was apparent that she looked down on anyone that didn't attend an Ivy League school. So one day she was doing that, and I couldn't stop myself. I said something like, "Oh, you went to Brown? And yet here we are, together in the same place doing the same job." Loved shocking people who thought we were hot stuff because everyone graduated from Stanford or Berkeley at one of my jobs. Here was me, a lowly director who spent a small amount of time at a community college in charge of reliability for the whole organization. Hilarious when we had college sweatshirt day, and mine was one no one knew. I was talking to a few coworkers in software engineering about education. 2 of these coworkers went to MIT. I said, "I went to community college and didn't graduate because I got an internship here." The team lead, who went to MIT, pointed at me and said, "He's the smart one of the bunch." That team lead was right. MIT and Ivy League schools are ridiculously expensive, so a community college sounds like a great option. Story 11. I worked for a statistician who had a PhD in statistics and was dumb as a post. On the other hand, I worked with this really smart guy who happened to have a PhD, and as he said it, all that means is I did the work for a PhD. I worked with a climate scientist who could analyze climate data like nobody's business, but if you wanted him to do literally anything else, you had to hold his hand the entire time. Zero common sense, too. The senior staff at that office idolized him because of the PhD after his name, but one time, he was in a car accident in a work vehicle, also his fault, and I asked for a copy of the police report for insurance purposes, and he said he didn't get one because he thought you handled that. Why would I, who was not present at the time of the accident, have the police report that was written at the time of the accident? The other guy that you ran into has one. I got a PhD, and it's always weird when people put that degree on a pedestal. All it really means is that I worked for a few years on a really big project and wrote a really long report for it. It's a signifier of the fact that I passed a bunch of requirements, including essentially writing a book on this big project that I did. It doesn't mean I've got any extra superpowers or extraordinary mental capabilities. I just got as much of a really big project as I could do before my funding ran out. I wrote the final third of my thesis in a single 44-hour-long session, complete with timed Adderall or Red Bull every 4 hours. I got up every 2 hours and would make myself walk around the building, and even timed my hydration intake down to the hour. I have never been, nor will I ever be, that productive in my life. Towards the end, I was seeing phantom people in my peripheral vision, and the air itself felt viscous. After that marathon session, I slept for 16 hours straight, and then started preparing for my defense slides. If I did that today, I would likely be dead. I appreciate these examples of people's honesty and self-awareness. Story 12. My college roommate, the smartest person I've ever met, spent nearly an hour trying to shove a desk back into the corner of our room at an angle. She wouldn't listen to me because, in her words, she's got this. After she finally gave up, I walked over, pulled the desk out completely and straightened it with the wall, and pushed it back in. One movement, no struggle. Many a time we had where I'd realized she might be the smart one, but I've got more common sense. I'm very confused on how someone can struggle to get a desk into a corner. It either fits or doesn't, and the walls provide very accurate, very immediate feedback. Please post a pic if you can. It was perfectly sized to fit between the corner and the beds that were built into the wall. Imagine a prison cell where everything was bolted down, except you could move the desk around. She'd moved her desk to face the window, pinning her chair between the desk and the bed. A few weeks before, so that she could look out the window as she wrote papers. Both the wall and the bed were stationary objects, and the desk would not fit at an angle. I'm trying to picture that, and it seems like if it didn't work one way, you just push it around the other way till it worked, even if you couldn't figure it out ahead of time. Story 13. Not quite a PhD, but I was at a party in the UK full of med students, and stereotypically everyone was off their face drunk. Well, some guy fell over and broke his collarbone and immediately got rushed by a dozen of them, all fussing and asking him the same questions over and over, going through the checklist. Half an hour later, he's still on the couch in pain, and I go in to ask if anybody knows why the ambulance is taking so long. Nobody had an answer because nobody had called one. A party full of medical students hadn't called an ambulance or made any transport arrangements for a guy in severe pain with a broken clavicle. Idiots. That's actually super common in emergencies when there's a group of any kind. One of the first things you learn in a lifeguard certification course is to identify a single person to instruct to call 911. Never just yell out, "Someone call 911," or assume that it's been done because everyone in the group is assuming someone else did it already. It's not necessarily that everyone forgot about it, just that everyone assumed it was the logical first step that someone else would have already taken. Singling someone out tends to work because in an emergency there are 50 random people all wanting to do something to help, but none of them willing to take charge of the situation in fear of messing it up. Single someone out and you will have taken charge of them and given them something to do that it's hard to be bad at, so they'll do it. That's a smart solution, and probably one that med students should have been trained to do. Story 14. I had a professor for higher mathematics who had real difficulties figuring out how to extract a cup of coffee from the vending machine. Bless him. Sounds like a relative of mine. A PhD in veterinary medicine by 30, has worked on genetic research in dogs and developed a new technique on measuring canine metabolism. Same person spent 2 whole lessons of driving school trying to figure out how the steering wheel works. To be clear, I don't think she's an idiot. The comment just reminded me of her. Sometimes I think she just processes things differently than most people. A girl I dated blew the engine in her car because she kept driving even though there was smoke billowing from under the hood and it was making lots of engine failure noises. She went on to med school at the University of Chicago. Oh wow, talk about specialty knowledge. That's taking it pretty far. Story 15. As someone who did 2 trades and then decided life is better with education, my experience currently going to uni is how clueless so many people are in uni. I wouldn't say they're an idiot, but tons of ignorance develops living in a student bubble your whole life. I rented a room to a guy who did his master's, and it would take him hours to cook dinner. I watched him one day and he just couldn't wrap his mind around cooking things that take different amounts of time to cook. Like he'd start cooking potatoes and wait till they were done before moving on to the next thing he was going to eat them with. Yep, I went to college right out of high school, and seemingly somehow I seemed to be the smartest out of any group of people when it came to anything unrelated to school. As in, people don't know anything common or basic except the other people like myself that ended up flunking out in the first or second semester. Now being 26, I'm returning to school to try again, and my SO is a freshman, and I've been to her uni, and it's even worse than in 2015. Literally brainless people on their phone crossing active streets, can't do basic addition without their phone. Google and ChatGPT are the only way to pass their classes, and when they speak, it's as if though a broken fence post became sentient, but has a 4.0 GPA. To expand on one of the many anecdotes I can give is how a girl genuinely thought binge drinking alcohol is necessary for your excretory system to work correctly, because, and I quote, "it puts it through its paces." She was going into the medical field. Another would be a guy who was an amazing writer and storyteller, could write 10-page essays like it was nothing, but couldn't figure out how to turn on his stove or use a washing machine. This fool would turn the machine on with his clothes in it, then once it was on the spin, he would squeeze dish soap. I asked, "Why? You're supposed to put detergent in at the start of the wash." And he said, "Oh, I just put the dish soap in last, as an extra kick. Why would I put detergent in a washing machine? They already washed the clothes." Needless to say, he smelled like someone took a dump in the Goodwill Dropbox, then threw some Dawn on top. These examples are so far out there, it's hard to imagine these getting along in life. Story 16. I used to work at a university, and tons of academics are incredibly educated in their chosen field, but have the common sense of your average dachshund. My favorite was probably an entire group of geology professors and PhD candidates who got stuck for a good few minutes in an entryway because they didn't think to check if the door required a pull rather than a push, bearing in mind that they'd just entered with that same door not an hour before. Was it the Midvale School for the Gifted? Is that the same group that was stuck on the broken escalator elevator for hours? No one should pass by an opportunity to make a Far Side reference. That's the rule. Story 17. My ex had a real lack of knowledge and common sense when it came to children. She's currently completing her PhD in biochemistry and molecular biology. She was confused though when I said I couldn't go out after putting my toddler to bed as I had no one to babysit. In her mind, once my daughter was asleep, she no longer needed anyone here to take care of her. I chalked it up to a cultural difference and never being around children. Eventually though, our opinions on raising kids differed too much and I had to end things for my daughter's sake. I think that's less to do with PhD, but an idiot in everything else, and more just not having experience with kids. I'm an only child, never hung around anyone younger than me as a child. None of my friends have kids, and I genuinely don't remember the last time I interacted with a child beyond passing them on the street. I know you shouldn't leave them alone in the house when they're sleeping because of safety reasons, but I'm completely clueless on how to handle them or what is normal or not. I'm the same. I don't know how to do baby talk to a kid, but also I feel it might be weird to just talk to them like an adult? And what if they're old enough that I'm trying to bring it down to their level, but it comes across as condescending? At what age does that happen? And I end up either underestimating how much they can actually comprehend at a young age, or overestimate their self-awareness. I just have no idea what all the stages are. Some people say that we were all kids once, so we should remember how we were or felt, but I honestly don't. I have a very selective and mostly vague memory of childhood. I just have snippets in my head, and I remember being around adults a lot and learning early on to be quiet, listen, and behave, but I don't remember internal workings of my mind. So anyway, all this makes me very uncomfortable and I haven't been in a situation where I had to interact with them, so I just don't. This is more a matter of no experience, I think. Story 18. A doctor telling me my 6-month-old couldn't have strep because she was an infant, and taking her to the ER because she was getting worse and no urgent cares were open, and finding out she had strep. We called an ambulance because we suspected that my wheelchair-bound brother-in-law had a bad bladder infection that was making him delirious. The EMTs didn't believe us because he seemed rational when he correctly answered questions like, "What's today's date?" and "Who is the president?" We insisted that he needed to go to the hospital. They said, "Okay, let's load him on the gurney." My BIL recoiled and said, "You can't put me on there, it's covered in spiders." Got one better. Psych nurse here got a fax on a patient at a local ER for possible psychiatric admission. Frequent flyers of ours on my unit. Her blood pressure was through the roof. She had facial drooping on one side, body paralysis on one side, and slurred speech. Anyone with a hint of healthcare knowledge will tell you that those are classic signs of an active stroke. So I called the ER, thinking maybe they meant to send the fax to our medical unit and sent it to us by mistake. Nope. I said, "You do know she's having a stroke with those symptoms, right?" ER nurse proceeds to tell me that the ER doc thinks she is faking those symptoms because she has a significant psychiatric history. I said, "So you think she's faking a blood pressure of 280/165 and body paralysis?" She hung up on me. Our psychiatrist calls the ER back on speaker to find out what's going on. The ER doctor tells her patient is faking these symptoms because, and I quote, "schizophrenics cannot have strokes." Our psychiatrist asked him where he went to med school because they owed him a refund. Common sense is lacking here. Listen, for goodness sake. Story 19. On a personal note, my wife was a PhD candidate when we moved in together. Early on, we went to a party, and when we got home, I told her I felt inadequate because I was the least educated person in every room and felt kinda dumb listening to them all go on about things I had no idea about. She said to me they each know the most about some little thing they just got their PhD about, some gene mutation or how some molecule interacts in some rarefied environment. But apart from that, they're all just regular people who can't figure out how to match their socks or talk to a member of the opposite sex. She said, "You're one of the most curious people I know. Your library is bigger and more diverse than anyone else I know, and you've actually read them. You ask questions and talk to everybody and have actual things to talk to them about because you know about things they're interested in." Now she's an MD PhD, and all our friends are doctors of one kind or another, and I'm still the least educated person at the party, but now I can see people are just people. And yes, you can be super smart about one thing or another and still be a screw-up in the real world. It's way more important to be a good, kind person who does what you say you'll do than the smartest kid in class. At least, that's how we raised our kids anyway. Your wife sounds like an amazing person. Together, you guys sound like you're great parents too. They're going to grow up very well-rounded. I have to admit, my wife is an amazing person, but here's the thing. I didn't marry a smart doctor. I married the same really cute 16-year-old girl I met in the hallway when I was the new kid in school. The girl who said yes to go to a jazz concert with me in 11th grade, and the girl who said she'd go to prom with me, and 5 minutes ago we were making supper and she said, "It's kinda unbelievable we still get to be married to each other." So yeah, I think she's pretty cool. This is the best comment to go out on here. What a great point of view, finding the best in each other. Thanks for watching until the end. If you have a similar story that you would like to share, please leave it in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please leave us a like and subscribe. For more videos like this one right now, please stop by our channel. Thanks again, and see you next time.